Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Detective Maria Santos had seen her share of violent crime in her 12 years with the Chicago PD, but nothing quite prepared her for what she found in apartment 4B on West Division Street that rainy Tuesday morning in October. The dispatch call had come in at 6:47 a.m. Wellness check, possible DOA, routine enough that Santos expected to find an elderly tenant who'd passed peacefully in their sleep. Instead, she stood in the doorway of what looked like a scene from a horror movie, her coffee growing cold in her hand as she processed the nightmare before her. The victim, later identified as Rebecca Walsh, 28 marketing coordinator, sat upright in her kitchen chair. But what made Santos's stomach lurch wasn't just that Rebecca was dead. It was how deliberately, almost artistically, the killer had arranged everything. Rebecca's hands were positioned palm down on the table, fingers spread exactly 12 inches apart. Her head was tilted at what appeared to be a precise 45-degree angle to the left. Most disturbing of all, someone had placed a single white rose in her lap, its stem cutting through what remained of her blouse. "Jesus Christ," muttered Officer Kowalski, Santos's partner, as he stepped into the apartment behind her. "What kind of sick freak does this?" Santos didn't answer immediately. She was studying the scene, her trained eye cataloging details that would matter later. The apartment was spotless except for the obvious signs of struggle near the front door. Overturned lamp, scattered mail, a broken picture frame. But the kitchen where Rebecca sat was pristine, almost sterile. "Get on the radio," Santos said quietly. "Tell dispatch we need the full circus. Forensics, coroner, crime scene unit. And call Lieutenant Morrison. Tell him we might have a problem." What Santos couldn't have known as she stood in that kitchen, watching the morning light filter through blood-spattered windows, was that Rebecca Walsh was just the beginning. Over the next 6 weeks, 3 more women would be found in identical poses, each with their own white rose, each positioned with the same mathematical precision that would earn their killer the media nickname, the Geometry Man. But that Tuesday morning, as Santos carefully stepped around the blood pooled beneath Rebecca's chair, all she knew was that someone very dangerous was loose in her city, and catching them was about to become her personal obsession. The first 24 hours of any homicide investigation are crucial, and Santos threw herself into Rebecca's case with the intensity that had made her one of the youngest detectives in the department's history. She spent Tuesday afternoon interviewing neighbors, starting with Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who lived across the hall and had called in the wellness check. "She was such a quiet girl," Mrs. Patterson said, clutching a tissue as they sat in her living room, surrounded by family photos and the smell of lavender air freshener. "Never any trouble, always said hello in the hallways. That's why I got worried when I didn't see her Sunday or Monday." "When did you last see Rebecca?" Santos asked, her notebook balanced on her knee. "Saturday evening, maybe around 7. She was coming home from grocery shopping. Had those canvas bags, you know, the environmental kind. She mentioned she was making dinner for someone Sunday night." Santos felt her pulse quicken. "Did she say who?" Mrs. Patterson shook her head. "Just said she had a date. First one I'd heard about in months. Poor thing worked so much, barely had time for herself. A date." Santos made a note and underlined it twice. She spent the next hour going door to door in the building, a converted warehouse in the gentrifying Logan Square neighborhood. Most residents barely knew Rebecca beyond polite nods, but a few details emerged. She worked late most nights. She ordered takeout frequently. She'd lived there about 2 years and kept to herself. But it was Rebecca's neighbor directly below, a grad student named Marcus, who provided the most useful information. "I heard her walking around Sunday night," he said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses nervously. "Maybe around 9 or 10. Then it got quiet. Really quiet. Usually I can hear her TV or music until at least midnight, but Sunday night, nothing after 10. Any voices? Like she might have had company?" Marcus thought for a moment. "Maybe. It's hard to tell with the old radiators making noise, but there might have been talking earlier in the evening, before it got quiet." Santos left the building with a working timeline. Rebecca had dinner planned Sunday night, possibly with a romantic interest. Someone had been in her apartment that evening, and by Monday morning she was dead. The key would be identifying her date. Back at the precinct, Santos dove into Rebecca's background. Her phone record showed 3 incoming calls Saturday evening. One from her mother in Springfield, one from a co-worker, and one from a number that traced back to a disconnected cell phone. The disconnected number had called her twice in the previous week. "Burner phone," said Detective Ray Chen, Santos's usual partner when they worked cases requiring multiple investigators. Chen was pushing 50, gray at the temples, and had the kind of patience that came from 20 years of police work. Someone wanted to stay off the grid. Rebecca's laptop, recovered from her bedroom, revealed an online dating profile on 3 different apps. She'd been active on all of them, messaging with dozens of men over the past few months. But one conversation stood out. A series of exchanges with someone calling himself David Architect that had started 3 weeks before her death. The messages began normally enough. Compliments on her photos, questions about her job, casual banter about favorite restaurants. But as Santos read through them, she noticed something odd. David's responses were always perfectly grammatical, almost formal, and he seemed to steer every conversation toward meeting in person, despite Rebecca's obvious preference for getting to know someone online first. "Look at this," Santos said, pointing to her computer screen as Chen looked over her shoulder. She suggests they video chat. He changes the subject. She asks for his last name to look him up on social media. He says he's old-fashioned and prefers to meet face-to-face. 3 different times she tries to slow things down, and 3 times he redirects. "Guy's either married or hiding something," Chen observed. "Or both." The conversation log showed that Rebecca had finally agreed to meet David for dinner Sunday night at her apartment. She'd offered to cook, he'd accepted. The last message was sent Saturday at 6:23 p.m. "See you tomorrow night at 7. Can't wait to finally meet you." Santos felt a chill run down her spine. Rebecca Walsh had invited her killer into her home. The forensics report arrived Thursday morning, and it painted a picture of extreme violence followed by methodical staging. Rebecca had been stabbed 7 times in the chest and abdomen, but the wounds were post-mortem. The actual cause of death was manual strangulation. Someone had choked her with their bare hands, but it was the other details that made the Santoses' skin crawl. The killer had cleaned up after themselves with military precision. Every surface in the kitchen had been wiped down with bleach. Rebecca's body had been washed and redressed in clean clothes. Even her fingernails had been scrubbed clean, eliminating any chance of DNA evidence under them. "This wasn't a crime of passion," said Dr. Jennifer Liu, the medical examiner, as she walked Santos through the findings. "The level of organization, the post-mortem staging, we're dealing with someone who's done this before. Any physical evidence at all?" "One thing," A fiber caught on the victim's bracelet. Synthetic material, probably from a carpet or upholstery. Navy blue. I'm running it through the database, but don't hold your breath. Santos spent Thursday afternoon working with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, sending them crime scene photos and witness statements. The profile that came back was unsettling. Organized killer, likely male, 25 to 45 years old, above average intelligence, possible history in the military or law enforcement, comfortable with technology but prefers face-to-face interactions. "He's not done," said Special Agent Sarah Martinez during their phone consultation. "The staging, the precision, this is someone who got satisfaction from what he did. He'll do it again, probably within the next few weeks." Agent Martinez was right. 3 weeks later, on a cold November morning, Santos got the call she'd been dreading. Another woman, found dead in her apartment, positioned in an identical pose with a white rose in her lap. This time, it was Jennifer Park, 31, a nurse at Northwestern Memorial, found by her roommate when she didn't show up for her shift. Santos arrived at the scene in Lincoln Park to find an almost carbon copy of Rebecca's crime scene. Jennifer sat upright in her kitchen chair, hands positioned exactly 12 inches apart, head tilted 45 degrees to the left. The apartment was spotless except for signs of struggle near the front door. But there were differences too. Jennifer's apartment was smaller, more cramped. And unlike Rebecca, who lived alone, Jennifer had a roommate, Sarah Kim, a fellow nurse who'd been working a double shift when Jennifer was killed. She'd been talking about some guy she met online, Sarah said, still shaking as she gave her statement. Said he seemed really nice, very polite. They'd been texting for a few weeks. Santos felt her stomach drop. Did she mention his name? David something. She showed me his picture on her phone, but now I can't find any of their conversations. It's like they were deleted. The investigation into Jennifer's death revealed the same pattern. Messages from someone using the name David on a dating app. Conversations that gradually moved toward an in-person meeting, and a burner phone number that had been disconnected immediately after the crime. But this time, Santos had an advantage. Sarah Kim had seen David's photo. Working with a police sketch artist, they created a composite that showed a man in his 30s with dark hair and generic features. It wasn't much to go on, but it was something. Santos had copies distributed to every dating app company, asking them to flag any profiles matching the description. The response was overwhelming. Dozens of David profiles on various apps, most of them clearly fake. But one stood out, David Contractor, on an app called Meet Me Chicago. The profile had been active for exactly 4 weeks, with photos that matched their composite sketch. Santos felt her pulse quicken as she scrolled through David Contractor's activity. He'd messaged 17 different women in the past month. Most hadn't responded, but 3 had engaged in longer conversations. One of them was still active. "We need to set up surveillance on Lisa Morrison," Santos told Lieutenant Morrison, no relation, as they huddled in his office Thursday evening. "According to her messages with this David guy, they're supposed to meet tomorrow night. You think she's his next target? I think we can't afford to assume she isn't." Lisa Morrison was a 29-year-old teacher who lived alone in a converted loft in the West Loop. Santos spent Friday afternoon briefing her on the situation, and Lisa agreed to cooperate with the sting operation, despite her obvious terror. "We'll have eyes on your building from 6 p.m. until midnight," Santos assured her. 2 teams in unmarked cars, plus Detective Chen in the building across the street with a clear sight line to your windows. If this David shows up, we'll have him before he gets to your front door. But David never showed. At 8:15 p.m., Lisa received a text message. Something came up at work. Can we reschedule for tomorrow night? Sorry for the short notice. Santos felt a mix of relief and frustration. Their suspect was cautious, possibly spooked by something. But that meant he was still out there, still hunting. The break came Sunday morning from an unexpected source. Santos was reviewing Jennifer Park's phone records for the third time when she noticed something she'd missed before. A call to a Chicago number at 3:47 p.m. on the day she died. The number belonged to a carpet cleaning service called Precision Clean. Why would a nurse call a carpet cleaning service the day she was murdered? Santos wondered aloud as she dialed the company's number. The answer sent chills down her spine. "Oh yeah, I remember that call," said the dispatcher, a woman named Carol with a heavy Chicago accent. Lady was asking about getting some kind of stain out of a white rose. Said her boyfriend had dropped one on her carpet and it left a mark. Weird thing to call about, you know? But she seemed really worried about it. A white rose. Jennifer had called about cleaning a white rose stain the day she died. Santos's mind raced as she considered the implications. Either Jennifer had somehow known about the killer's signature, or... Carol? Did the caller leave a callback number? Yeah, let me check. Here it is. But it's not the same number that came up on caller ID. She gave me a different number to call back if we had questions. Santos wrote down both numbers, her hand trembling slightly. The callback number Jennifer had provided was the same disconnected cell phone that had been used to contact both victims. Someone had called the carpet cleaning service pretending to be Jennifer, asking about white rose stains hours before she was killed. The killer wasn't just methodical. He was taunting them. That Sunday afternoon, Santos sat in her apartment staring at the evidence board she'd set up on her living room wall. Photos of both victims, crime scene images, phone records, dating app screenshots, dozens of pieces that should form a pattern. But the killer remained a ghost. Her phone rang at 9:23 p.m. Unknown number. Detective Santos? The voice was male, calm, with what sounded like a slight accent. Yes, who is this? I think you know. I've been following the news coverage of my work. Very thorough investigation, Detective. I'm impressed. Santos's heart began racing as she frantically gestured toward her landline, where she'd rigged a recording device. What do you want? To let you know that I appreciate the challenge you're providing. But I'm afraid your surveillance operation Friday night was a bit obvious. I saw Detective Chen in the building across from Lisa's loft. Nice spotting scope, by the way. The line went dead. Santos immediately called in the threat, and within an hour, Lisa Morrison was in protective custody. But the damage was done. The killer knew they were getting close, and he was escalating. Monday morning brought devastating news. A third victim, found in her apartment in Wicker Park. Same pose, same white rose, same methodical cleaning. This time it was Ashley Rodriguez, 33, a graphic designer who lived alone with her cat. But something was different about Ashley's scene. For the first time, the killer had made a mistake. Look at this, said crime scene investigator Tom Brennan, pointing to a small scratch on Ashley's kitchen table. Looks like someone scraped something metallic across the surface. Maybe a ring or a watch. Under microscopic examination, the scratch revealed traces of silver and copper, the composition of a specific type of police badge. Son of a bitch is a cop, Chen said as they stood in the precinct hallway reviewing the lab results. Or was a cop or security guard, something in law enforcement. Santos felt sick. They'd been hunting someone who understood their methods because he'd been trained in them. It explained the careful crime scene management, the knowledge of forensic procedures, the ability to stay one step ahead of their investigation. We need to run this through personnel files, Santos said. Current and former CPD, Sheriff's Department, private security, anyone with law enforcement training who matches our profile. The search took 3 days and yielded 47 possible matches. Santos and Chen worked around the clock, interviewing supervisors, checking alibis, reviewing employment records. Most of the candidates were quickly eliminated, but 5 remained viable suspects. One of them was David Korhonen, 34, a former Chicago police officer who'd been dismissed from the force 18 months earlier following allegations of excessive violence during an arrest. He'd worked patrol in the Logan Square district, the same area where Rebecca Walsh lived. Santos felt her pulse quicken as she read through Korhonen's file. Multiple complaints about his treatment of female suspects. A restraining order filed by an ex-girlfriend who claimed he'd stalked her. And most interesting of all, he'd taken a job with a private security firm after leaving CPD, a company that required extensive background checks on dating app users. He's got access to dating profiles through his work, Chen observed as they sat in Santos's car outside Korhonen's apartment building in Albany Park. Perfect way to scout victims. But when they knocked on his door, Korhonen wasn't home. According to his landlord, he'd been gone for 3 days, claiming he had a family emergency out of state. Santos felt a familiar chill. 3 days ago was when Ashley Rodriguez had been murdered. They put out a BOLO alert for Korhonen and his vehicle, a dark blue Ford Explorer registered in his name. But Santos had a growing fear that he was already hunting his next victim. The answer came Tuesday evening in the form of another phone call. "Detective Santos, I trust you've identified me by now." It was the same calm voice, but this time there was something different in his tone. Excitement, maybe even pleasure. "David Korhonen, former CPD. You're done running." "Am I? I don't think so. In fact, I think I'm just getting started. You see, Detective, I've been studying your investigation. Very impressive work, but I've learned something interesting about you." Santos felt ice in her veins. "What are you talking about?" "You live alone in that nice little condo on North Lake Shore Drive. Unit 14B, you drive a silver Honda Civic. You stop at the same Starbucks every Tuesday morning and order a large coffee, 2 sugars, no cream." The phone went dead, and Santos found herself alone in her apartment, suddenly very aware of every shadow, every sound from the hallway outside. She called for immediate protection detail and spent that night in a safe house, but she knew Korhonen was toying with her. He could have made his move already if he'd wanted to. Instead, he was playing a game, and she was a piece on his board. Wednesday morning brought a break. A patrol unit spotted Korhonen's Explorer parked outside a coffee shop in Bucktown. When they moved in to arrest him, they found the vehicle empty, but the discovery inside made Santos's blood run cold. The Explorer contained a detailed surveillance kit, cameras with telephoto lenses, listening devices, GPS trackers. But more disturbing was the collection of photographs. Pictures of Santos entering and leaving her apartment, eating lunch at various restaurants, even talking with witnesses outside Rebecca Walsh's building. He'd been watching her from the beginning. "There's something else," said Officer Martinez as Santos examined the evidence. "We found 5 different cell phones in the glove compartment. All of them have dating apps installed." Santos felt pieces clicking into place. Korhonen wasn't using one fake profile. He was running multiple identities, probably targeting several women simultaneously. The question was, how many were already in danger? The answer came when Chen's phone rang at 2:47 p.m. "Detective Chen, this is Sarah Morrison. Lisa Morrison's sister. Lisa's missing. She didn't show up for work this morning, and her apartment door is standing wide open." Santos and Chen raced to Lisa's building, their worst fears confirmed when they found her loft empty, with obvious signs of struggle. But this time, Korhonen had deviated from his pattern. Instead of killing Lisa in her apartment, he'd taken her somewhere else. A ransom note, typed on plain white paper, was taped to her refrigerator. Detective Santos, you have until midnight to meet me at the location I'll text you. Come alone, no backup, no surveillance. If I see any other police, Lisa Morrison dies very slowly. You've been hunting me for weeks. Time to finish the game. Santos stared at the note, her hands shaking. Korhonen had escalated from serial killer to kidnapper, and she was his ultimate target. You're not going, Chen said firmly. We'll find another way. But Santos knew there wasn't time. Every hour they delayed increased the chances that Lisa Morrison would become victim number 4. At 11:47 p.m., Santos's phone buzzed with a text message containing an address in an industrial area near the Chicago River. She'd already made her decision. She was going, despite direct orders from Lieutenant Morrison to wait for backup. She drove through the empty streets with her service weapon checked and a small recording device hidden in her jacket pocket. Whatever happened at the warehouse, she wanted evidence of Korhonen's crimes. The building was dark, except for a single light in a second-floor window. Santos approached carefully, every shadow potentially hiding danger. The front door was unlocked. Korhonen wanted her to come inside. She found Lisa Morrison tied to a chair in the center of a large, empty room, conscious but clearly terrified. Korhonen stood behind her, one hand resting on Lisa's shoulder, the other holding a long-bladed knife. Detective Santos, right on time. He was taller than she'd expected, with the kind of physical presence that came from years of police training. But his eyes were what scared her most. Flat, emotionless, like looking into a void. Let her go, David. This is between you and me. Is it? I don't think so. You see, Detective, this has never been about the women I killed. They were just practice. Preparation for this moment. Santos kept her distance, acutely aware that Korhonen could kill Lisa with a single motion. Preparation for what? For proving that I'm smarter than the entire Chicago Police Department, that I can take their best detective and make her watch while I complete my masterpiece. The knife moved to Lisa's throat, and Santos saw her chance. She'd noticed a stack of old lumber near the wall. If she could create a distraction, maybe get Korhonen to move away from his hostage. You know what I think, David? I think you're scared. Scared that you're not as smart as you believe. That's why you needed to target me, because deep down, you know I'm going to catch you. Korhonen's expression shifted, anger flashing in those dead eyes. You arrogant bitch, you have no idea what you're dealing with. He stepped away from Lisa, moving toward Santos with the knife raised, and she knew she had one chance. As he closed the distance, she dove toward the lumber pile, grabbing a short piece of 2x4 just as Korhonen lunged at her. The makeshift weapon caught him across the wrist, and the knife went flying. But Korhonen was bigger, stronger, and trained in hand-to-hand combat. He tackled Santos to the ground, his hands wrapping around her throat. As her vision began to darken, Santos heard the sound she'd been praying for. Footsteps on the stairs, shouting voices. Chen had followed her despite her orders to stay away. The cavalry arrived just as Santos lost consciousness, and the last thing she remembered was the sound of gunshots echoing through the warehouse. She woke up in a hospital bed 36 hours later to learn that David Korhonen was dead, killed in the shootout with backup officers. Lisa Morrison was safe, physically unharmed but traumatized. The nightmare was over. But as Santos lay in her hospital bed, recovering from a concussion and bruised windpipe, She couldn't shake the feeling that Korhonen had been telling the truth about one thing. The 4 women he'd killed had been practice for something bigger. A week later, while clearing out Korhonen's apartment, investigators found a detailed plan for what he called the final performance, a scheme to kidnap and kill 12 women simultaneously, all positioned in identical poses throughout the city. Santos had stopped him 3 weeks before he planned to execute the largest serial killing spree in Chicago's history. The case officially closed on December 15th, but Santos still has nightmares about those flat, emotionless eyes and the calm voice that haunted her phone calls. She requested a transfer to the white-collar crime division, where the stakes feel lower, and the criminals rarely try to strangle their investigators. But sometimes, on quiet nights when she's alone in her apartment, she still checks the locks twice and keeps her service weapon within arm's reach. Because she learned that evil doesn't always announce itself with violence and chaos. Sometimes it comes calling with flowers and polite conversation, and by the time you realize what you're dealing with, it's already too late. The warehouse where the final confrontation took place was demolished 6 months later, replaced by luxury condominiums that overlook the Chicago River. But Santos drives by the location sometimes, remembering the night she almost became the 4th victim of a killer who saw murder as art and human beings as materials for his twisted masterpiece. The dating apps where Korhonen found his victims implemented new security measures, requiring video verification and background checks for users. But Santos knows that determined predators will always find new ways to hunt, and somewhere in the city, another David is probably creating his profile, choosing his victims and planning his own perfect crime. The only comfort she takes is in the knowledge that there are other detectives like her out there, watching for patterns, following evidence, and standing between the hunters and their prey. Because in a city like Chicago, the monsters are real, but so are the people who hunt them back. Detective Mike Brennan was 3 days into his vacation when the call came in. He'd been sitting on the deck of his cabin in Wisconsin, watching the sunset over Pine Lake with a cold beer in his hand, and no intention of thinking about police work for the next 10 days. But when his phone rang and he saw Lieutenant Sarah Chen's name on the screen, he knew his time off was about to be cut short. "Mike, I'm sorry to bother you, but we've got a situation. High-profile missing person case, and the brass wants our best on it." Brennan took a long sip of his beer and sighed. How high-profile are we talking? Amanda Richardson, ring a bell? It did. Amanda Richardson was the 17-year-old daughter of State Senator Robert Richardson, one of Illinois' most prominent politicians and a rumored candidate for governor. The kind of case that could make or break careers depending on how it played out. When did she go missing? 48 hours ago. She was supposed to be at a sleepover with friends, but when her parents called to check on her yesterday morning, they found out she never showed up. No one's seen her since Friday evening. Brennan was already packing his bag as Chen continued. The family's hired a private investigator, but they want police involvement too. Senator Richardson specifically asked for you by name. Me? I've never met the man. Apparently, he remembers your work on the Kozlov kidnapping case. Said he wants someone who knows how to handle sensitive situations. The Kozlov case had been 3 years ago. A diplomat's son taken for ransom by a group of Russian mobsters. Brennan had managed to resolve it without any media leaks or international incidents, which had earned him some recognition in political circles. "All right, I'm on my way back. What do we know so far?" "Not much." Amanda left her house Friday around 7 p.m., telling her parents she was going to spend the night at her friend Katie's house. But Katie says Amanda never showed up, and her phone's been going straight to voicemail since Saturday morning. Brennan made the 3-hour drive back to Chicago in record time, his mind already working the angles. Missing teenager from a prominent family, Could be a kidnapping for ransom. Could be a runaway situation. Could be something worse. The first 72 hours were critical, and they'd already lost 2 days. He arrived at the Richardson family's Lincoln Park mansion at 9 p.m. Sunday night, noting the news vans already gathering across the street despite the family's attempts to keep the story quiet. The house was a massive Victorian-era structure with perfect landscaping and the kind of old-money elegance that screamed political power. Senator Richardson met him at the door. A tall, silver-haired man in his 50s with the practiced handshake and eye contact of someone who'd spent his life in politics. But beneath the polished exterior, Brennan could see genuine fear and exhaustion. "Detective Brennan, thank you for coming. Please, come in." The senator led him into a study lined with law books and political memorabilia, where Amanda's mother, Patricia Richardson, sat on a leather couch clutching a coffee cup with shaking hands. She was an attractive woman in her 40s, but grief and worry had aged her visibly in the past 2 days. "Mrs. Richardson," Brennan said gently as he took a seat across from them, "I know this is difficult, but I need to ask some questions about Amanda's behavior in the weeks before she disappeared." Patricia nodded, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. She'd been different lately, more secretive, spending a lot of time on her phone, going out with friends we didn't know. "Any specific incidents that concerned you?" Senator Richardson spoke up. 2 weeks ago, we found out she'd been lying about where she was spending her evenings. Said she was at the library studying for SATs, but when I called to check, they said she hadn't been there. Did you confront her about it? We tried, but Amanda has always been strong-willed. She said we were being overprotective, that she needed space to make her own decisions. Brennan made notes as they talked, building a picture of a typical teenage rebellion scenario. But something about the parents' demeanor suggested there was more to the story. "I need to see Amanda's room," he said, "and I'll want to speak with her friends, starting with Katie Morrison." Amanda's bedroom was on the second floor, overlooking the mansion's back garden. It was immaculately decorated in pale blues and whites, with expensive furniture and college pennants from Harvard, Yale, and Northwestern. But as Brennan searched through her belongings, he found several items that didn't fit the image of a privileged teenager preparing for college. Hidden behind a row of textbooks was a small wooden box containing nearly $3,000 in cash, all in small bills. Under her mattress, he found a prepaid cell phone that wasn't the iPhone her parents had mentioned. And in the back of her closet, behind winter coats, was a black leather jacket and boots that looked completely out of character for someone who usually wore designer dresses and pearls. "Senator Richardson," Brennan called as he returned to the study. "Did Amanda have a job? Any source of income beyond her allowance?" "No, nothing like that. We gave her everything she needed." Brennan showed them the cash. "Then where did she get $3,000? The look that passed between the senator and his wife told Brennan they were about to learn something important. "There's something we haven't told you," Patricia said quietly. "About 6 months ago, Amanda started asking questions about her adoption." "Adoption?" Senator Richardson nodded reluctantly. "We adopted Amanda when she was 3 years old. Her biological parents died in a car accident, and Patricia and I were her legal guardians through my law firm. We'd always planned to tell her, but it never seemed like the right time," Patricia finished. "And as she got older, it became harder to bring up." Brennan felt pieces clicking into place. "Did she find out on her own?" "We think so. She'd been acting strange ever since she turned 17 in March. More withdrawn, asking questions about her early childhood that we couldn't answer." "What kind of questions?" "Where she was born, why she didn't look like us, whether we knew anything about her birth parents' families." We kept deflecting, hoping it would pass, but I think she started investigating on her own. A teenage girl discovering she was adopted, with a secret phone and large amounts of cash. Brennan was starting to see the outline of what might have happened to Amanda Richardson. His next stop was Katie Morrison's house, a more modest home in the North Shore suburbs where Amanda was supposed to have spent Friday night. Katie was a thin, nervous girl with blonde hair and the kind of anxiety that suggested she was hiding something. "I already told the other detective everything I know," Katie said, as they sat in her family's living room, her parents hovering protectively nearby. "I'd like to hear it again," Brennan said gently. "Sometimes people remember new details when they tell the story a second time." Katie's story was consistent with what her parents had already told police. Amanda was supposed to come over Friday night for a sleepover, but she never showed up. Katie had tried calling and texting, but never got a response. But when Brennan asked about Amanda's recent behavior, Katie's demeanor changed. She'd been really weird lately, like obsessed with finding out about her real family. She showed me some websites she'd been looking at. Adoption registries, genealogy sites, that kind of stuff. Did she find anything? Katie glanced nervously at her parents. Maybe. She told me she thought she'd found her biological grandmother, some woman living in Indiana. She was planning to reach out to her. Did she mention a name? Margaret something? Margaret Petrov, I think? Brennan felt a chill. Petrov, a Russian name that reminded him of the organized crime families he'd dealt with in previous cases. He spent the next hour interviewing Katie more thoroughly, and gradually a picture emerged of Amanda's secret life. She'd been using the prepaid phone to contact people her parents didn't know about. She'd been meeting with someone downtown several times over the past month. Someone Katie described as an older woman who looked kind of tough. Did Amanda ever mention feeling threatened? Like someone might want to hurt her? Katie shook her head. She was excited, actually. Said she was finally going to learn the truth about where she came from. But she made me promise not to tell her parents because they'd try to stop her. Brennan left the Morrison house with more questions than answers, but at least he had a lead. Margaret Petrov, if she was connected to the Russian criminal networks he'd encountered before, Amanda Richardson might be in more danger than anyone realized. Back at the precinct Monday morning, Brennan ran Margaret Petrov's name through the database and felt his stomach drop. She was listed as the grandmother of Viktor Petrov, a mid-level figure in Chicago's Russian organized crime network who'd been arrested twice for money laundering. But more importantly, she was also the mother of Dmitry and Natasha Petrov, two Russian immigrants who'd been killed in a suspicious car accident 17 years ago, right around the time Amanda would have been orphaned. "Jesus Christ," muttered Detective Ray Santos as she looked over Brennan's shoulder at the computer screen. The kid's not just adopted, she's the daughter of dead Russian criminals. Which means the people who killed her parents might not want her alive to ask questions about it. Brennan immediately called Senator Richardson, asking him to meet at the precinct rather than discussing details over the phone. When the senator arrived an hour later, his face was pale and drawn. Brennan led him into an interview room and closed the door before dropping the bombshell. "Senator, Amanda's biological parents weren't random car accident victims. They were Dmitry and Natasha Petrov, Russian immigrants with connections to organized crime who were murdered 17 years ago." Richardson's hands began to shake. "That's impossible. The adoption agency said they were college students who died in an accident. The adoption agency lied, or someone paid them to lie." Brennan pulled out the case file. Dmitry Petrov was suspected of laundering money for Russian criminal organizations through a series of legitimate businesses. Someone wanted him dead, and they got both him and his wife. "My God," Richardson whispered. "Amanda's been trying to contact these people?" Her biological grandmother, Margaret Petrov, and possibly others. Brennan leaned forward. "Senator, I need you to think carefully. Has anyone approached you in the past few months asking questions about Amanda? Anyone showing unusual interest in your family?" Richardson was quiet for a long moment, his political mind clearly working through implications. There was something. "About a month ago, a woman called my office claiming to be a genealogist working on a family tree project. She wanted to know about Amanda's birth records, medical history, that sort of thing. My assistant told her we don't discuss family matters with strangers." "Did she give a name?" "I'd have to check with my office, but I remember my assistant saying she had a Russian accent." Brennan felt the case gaining momentum. Someone in the Petrov family had been looking for Amanda, and now she was missing. The question was whether she'd gone to them voluntarily or been taken. His phone rang as they finished the interview. Detective Santos calling from the field. "Mike, we found Amanda's car. It's parked outside a restaurant in Little Village, but there's no sign of her." Little Village was Chicago's Mexican neighborhood, but it also had a significant Eastern European population, including several businesses known to be fronts for Russian criminal operations. "Which restaurant?" "Place called Borscht and Bread. According to the hostess, Amanda was here Friday night around 9 p.m. She met with an older woman for about an hour, then left on foot. Description of the woman? 60-something, gray hair, well-dressed, spoke with a Russian accent, paid cash and didn't give a name." Brennan hung up and turned to Senator Richardson. "Your daughter met with someone Friday night, then disappeared. We need to move fast." Borscht and Bread was a small restaurant tucked between a currency exchange and a used car lot, the kind of place that catered to homesick immigrants and anyone looking for authentic Eastern European cuisine. The owner, a stocky man named Boris Volkov, was reluctant to talk until Brennan showed him his badge. "The girl was here Friday, yes," Boris admitted in heavily accented English. "She meet with Mrs. Petrov. They talk for maybe 1 hour." "Margaret Petrov?" Boris nodded. "She come here sometimes. Nice lady, but—" He made a gesture suggesting she wasn't someone to cross. "Did you hear any of their conversation?" "Little bit. The girl, she asked many questions about her mama and papa. Mrs. Petrov, she tells stories about when they was young. Sad stories." "Did they leave together?" "Number Mrs. Petrov leave first. The girl, she sit alone for maybe 10 minutes, then she go too. But she look, how you say, excited. Like she learned something important." Brennan showed Boris a photo of Amanda. "Have you seen her since Friday night?" Boris studied the picture carefully, then shook his head. "No, not since then. But Mrs. Petrov, she come in yesterday asking if the girl call or come back. She was looking for Amanda, too." "Yes, she seemed worried. Say the girl was supposed to meet her again, but never show up." This put a new spin on the case. If Margaret Petrov was also looking for Amanda, it suggested the girl hadn't gone to stay with her grandmother voluntarily. Someone else might have taken her. Brennan's next stop was Margaret Petrov's apartment, a tidy one-bedroom unit in a senior living complex on the northwest side. Mrs. Petrov was a small gray-haired woman in her 70s, with the kind of sharp eyes that missed nothing, and a wariness that came from decades of dealing with dangerous people. "You are police," she said as she opened the door. Not a question, but a statement. "Detective Brennan, Chicago PD, I'd like to ask you about Amanda Richardson." Mrs. Petrov's expression softened slightly. "My granddaughter, please come in." The apartment was small but immaculately kept, with family photos covering every available surface. Brennan noticed several pictures of a young couple he recognized as Dmitri and Natasha Petrov, along with baby photos that must have been Amanda. Mrs. Petrov, when did Amanda first contact you? 3 weeks ago. She found me through one of those internet sites, the ones for finding family. She sent me letters saying she think I am her babushka, and could we meet? And you agreed, of course. She is my son's child, my only grandchild. I thought she was dead for 17 years, and suddenly she is alive and looking for me. Is like miracle. Mrs. Petrov served tea as she told her story. Amanda had been cautious at first, meeting in public places and asking careful questions about her biological parents. But as she learned more about her family history, she'd become more trusting, more eager to understand where she came from. She asked many questions about the night her parents die. Mrs. Petrov said quietly, I tell her what I know, but it's not much. Dmitri and Natasha, they was trying to leave the business, start new life somewhere safe. But some people, they not want to let them go. Who didn't want to let them go? Mrs. Petrov's eyes hardened. You know about my son's work, yes? The money business? Brennan nodded. Money laundering for criminal organizations. Dmitri, he was not bad man, but he get involved with wrong people when he was young. By the time he want out, he know too much. They kill him and Natasha to keep them quiet. And Amanda? We think she died too in the car. Only later I find out someone take her, give her to new family. Maybe whoever kill her parents, they have conscience about killing baby. Or maybe they think she could be useful someday. Brennan felt a chill. Useful how? Dmitri, he hide money before he die. Lots of money, maybe millions. He tell me he put it somewhere safe for Amanda when she grow up, but he never tell me where. Now, they were getting to the heart of it. Amanda wasn't just the daughter of dead Russian criminals. She was potentially the key to finding millions in hidden money. And if the wrong people found out she was alive and looking for answers, she'd become a target. Mrs. Petrov, who else knew that Amanda had contacted you? The old woman's face went pale. I tell no one, but Friday night, after I meet with Amanda, someone break into my apartment. They don't take nothing, but they go through all my papers, my computer. They was looking for something. What time was this? Maybe midnight, 1 o'clock. I was sleeping, but I hear noise. When I get up to look, my front door is open and my papers are everywhere. Brennan's phone rang. Detective Santos again. Mike, we've got a problem. I just got off the phone with the FBI. They've been watching several members of the Petrov organization for money laundering, and Amanda Richardson's name came up in their surveillance. What kind of surveillance? Wiretaps. Apparently, there's been chatter for the past month about finding Dmitri's daughter and getting her to talk about what her father might have told her before he died. When was the last intercept? Saturday morning. Someone made a call saying they'd found the girl and were moving to secure the asset. Brennan hung up and turned to Mrs. Petrov, who had obviously understood enough of the conversation to look terrified. Mrs. Petrov, I need you to think carefully. Did Amanda mention anyone else she'd been in contact with? Anyone who claimed to be family or friends of her parents? The old woman wrung her hands. She mentioned a man who called her a few days ago. Say he was friend of her papa, that he have things that belonged to her. She was excited, say she going to meet him Sunday. Sunday? Yesterday? Yes. She's supposed to call me after, but she never do. That's why I was worried. Brennan felt time running out. If Amanda had met with someone Sunday who claimed to be her father's friend, and she'd been missing since then, the chances of finding her alive were getting slimmer by the hour. Did she mention where she was supposed to meet this man? Some warehouse by the river. She say he have box of her papa's things to give her. The Chicago River had dozens of warehouse districts, but Brennan had a feeling he knew which one. The old industrial area near North Branch was known territory for Russian criminal operations. Plenty of isolated buildings where someone could conduct business without interference. He called for backup and rushed to the warehouse district, leaving Mrs. Petrov in protective custody with 2 uniformed officers. If Amanda was still alive, every minute counted. The warehouse district was a maze of abandoned buildings and empty lots, the kind of place where bodies could disappear forever. Brennan and Santos, along with 4 patrol units and a SWAT team, began a systematic search of the most likely locations. They found Amanda in the basement of a building owned by a shell company that traced back to known Petrov associates. She was alive but barely conscious, tied to a chair in a room that looked like it had been used for interrogations before. Her captors were gone, but they'd left behind evidence of what they'd been trying to do. The room contained a briefcase full of documents, bank records, safe deposit box keys, and what looked like a partial map of Chicago, with several locations marked in red. "Jesus," Santos whispered as she cut Amanda's restraints. They were torturing her for information about her father's hidden money. Amanda was rushed to Northwestern Memorial Hospital with dehydration, multiple bruises, and what appeared to be electrical burns on her arms and legs. But she was alive, and as she recovered over the next few days, she was able to provide details about her captivity that helped Brennan understand the full scope of what had happened. "They kept asking me about things my father supposedly told me," Amanda said from her hospital bed, her voice hoarse. "Bank account numbers, safe deposit box locations, passwords. They wouldn't believe that I never knew him, that I was adopted as a baby." "How many people were holding you?" "3 men. Russians, I think, based on their accents. They seemed to think my adoptive parents had told me secret information about hidden money, or that I'd inherited some kind of code or key from my biological father." "Did they mention any names?" Amanda nodded weakly. "The leader, the other 2 called him Alexei. He kept saying they were running out of time, that other people were looking for the same information and they had to find it first." Brennan recognized the name. Alexei Volkov was a mid-level enforcer for the Russian criminal network, known for his expertise in enhanced interrogation techniques. If he'd been involved in Amanda's kidnapping, it meant the stakes were higher than just family reunion. The FBI task force moved quickly once they had Volkov's name. Within 6 hours, they'd tracked him to a safe house in Cicero where he was hiding with 2 associates. The raid recovered additional evidence, linking the group to a series of violent crimes related to their search for Dmitry Petrov's hidden assets. But the most important discovery came when agents searched Volkov's personal effects. Hidden in a false bottom of his briefcase was a safety deposit box key, and a handwritten note in Russian that, when translated, provided directions to a storage unit on the south side of Chicago. The storage unit contained nearly $4 million in cash, along with detailed records of Russian criminal money laundering operations dating back 20 years. Dmitry Petrov had indeed hidden money before his death, not for his daughter, but as insurance against the people who were planning to kill him. He was going to trade the money and records for safe passage out of the country, explained FBI agent Sarah Martinez, as she briefed Brennan on the case's conclusion. When they killed him anyway, the storage unit became a time bomb. Whoever found it would have enough evidence to bring down half the Russian criminal network in Chicago. And they thought Amanda might know where it was. They thought her adoptive parents might have been told something, or that Dmitry might have left her some kind of clue. Desperate thinking, but when you're looking at life in prison or worse, people grasp at straws. Amanda Richardson recovered from her physical injuries within a few weeks, but the psychological trauma would take much longer to heal. She'd learned the truth about her biological parents. but at a cost that no teenager should have to pay. Senator Richardson, grateful for his daughter's safe return, became a strong advocate for victims' rights legislation and increased funding for organized crime task forces. He never did run for governor, choosing instead to focus on his family and helping other parents navigate similar crises. Mrs. Petrov used her share of the recovered money to establish a foundation helping immigrant families affected by organized crime. She and Amanda developed a cautious but genuine relationship, with the understanding that some family histories are too dangerous to explore fully. As for Detective Brennan, the case earned him a commendation and a promotion to the FBI Joint Task Force on Organized Crime. But it also left him with a deeper understanding of how the past can reach out to claim innocent victims, and how sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is go looking for answers about where you came from. The warehouse where Amanda was held was demolished 6 months later, replaced by a trendy shopping complex. But Brennan still drives by the location sometimes, remembering the scared teenager they'd found in that basement, and wondering how many other secrets are buried in Chicago's industrial graveyards. The adoption agency that had facilitated Amanda's placement was investigated and shut down for falsifying records and taking bribes from criminal organizations. Several other children were identified as having been placed under similar circumstances, leading to a comprehensive review of international adoption practices. Amanda Richardson, now in college studying international relations, occasionally speaks at conferences about adoption rights and victim advocacy. She never returned to the warehouse district, but she keeps the key to her father's storage unit as a reminder that some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some family reunions come at too high a price. Detective Brennan learned that in missing person cases, sometimes finding someone means discovering they were never really lost. They were hidden, protected from a past that would have destroyed them. And sometimes, the greatest gift you can give someone isn't the truth about where they came from, but the safety to choose who they want to become. Detective Tony Marconi had been working organized crime for 8 years when the call came in that would change everything. It was a rainy Thursday morning in October, and he was sitting at his desk in the Chicago PD's Organized Crime Division, nursing his third cup of coffee and reviewing surveillance photos from the Torino family's latest gambling operation. The phone rang at 9:23 a.m. Marconi. "Detective, this is Agent Sarah Kim, FBI Financial Crimes. We need to meet. Today. And you're going to want to bring your files on the Torino organization." Marconi knew Kim by reputation, a sharp federal agent who specialized in following money trails through organized crime networks. If she was calling him directly, something big was happening. "What's this about?" "Not over the phone. Meet me at the Starbucks on North Michigan in an hour. Come alone, and bring everything you have on Vincent Torino's legitimate businesses." The line went dead, leaving Marconi staring at his phone with a familiar feeling of unease. In 8 years of working organized crime, he'd learned that when the FBI called with cryptic messages, it usually meant someone was about to die or someone already had. Vincent "Vinny" Torino was a third-generation mob boss who'd inherited control of Chicago's South Side rackets from his father. Unlike the old-school gangsters who relied on violence and intimidation, Vinny was a businessman first, laundering money through a network of restaurants, construction companies, and real estate ventures that looked completely legitimate on paper. Marconi had been building a case against the Torino organization for 3 years, slowly mapping their operations and financial structure. But Vinny was careful, smart, and surrounded by lawyers who knew how to exploit every loophole in federal law. An hour later, Marconi sat across from Agent Kim in the crowded Starbucks, watching her review his case files with the intensity of a surgeon examining X-rays. "How much do you know about Torino's restaurant business?" she asked without looking up. He owns 12 establishments throughout the city. All appear to be profitable, all pay their taxes. We suspect they're laundering money, but we've never been able to prove it. Kim nodded and pulled out a tablet, showing him a series of financial documents. What if I told you that over the past 18 months, those restaurants have been processing payments for something that has nothing to do with food service? I'd ask, what kind of payments? The kind that suggest Vincent Torino has expanded beyond traditional organized crime into something much more dangerous. Kim leaned forward, lowering her voice. We have evidence that he's been facilitating payments for a human trafficking network that spans from Chicago to Miami. Marconi felt his stomach drop. Human trafficking was a different kind of evil, one that made traditional mob activities look almost quaint by comparison. What kind of evidence? Kim showed him bank records on her tablet. Thousands of wire transfers between Torino's restaurants and accounts in Florida, Mexico, and Eastern Europe. The amounts were substantial, ranging from $50,000 to $200,000 per transaction. The payments are disguised as food service contracts, but the money's going to shell companies that don't exist. And the timing coincides with known human trafficking routes from Central America through Chicago and down to Florida. How did you uncover this? A joint operation with Homeland Security. They've been tracking a network that smuggles young women from Guatemala and Honduras into the U.S., promising them legitimate work. Instead, they're forced into prostitution in massage parlors and escort services throughout the Midwest. Marconi studied the financial records, his trained eye picking out patterns that suggested sophisticated money laundering. Where do I come in? 3 days ago, one of the victims escaped from a house in Cicero. She's been talking to federal agents, and she's given us information that could bring down the entire network. But there's a problem. Kim pulled up a photo on her tablet. A young woman, maybe 20 years old, with dark hair, and the kind of haunted expression that comes from prolonged trauma. Her name is Maria Santos. She's from Honduras. Been in the country illegally for 8 months. The people who held her told her that if she ever tried to escape, they'd kill her and her family back home. And she escaped anyway? She was being moved from one location to another when their van broke down on I-294. In the confusion, she ran into traffic and flagged down a state trooper. She's been in protective custody ever since. Marconi was beginning to see the shape of the problem. But now, the people who held her know she's talking to law enforcement. Exactly. And according to Maria, the operation is run by someone she only knew as Mr. Vincent. Someone who spoke perfect English and Italian, who wore expensive suits, and who visited the house in Cicero twice a month to collect money. Vincent Torino. It had to be. What does Maria say about the operation? Kim pulled up more photos. Surveillance shots of a modest house in a working-class neighborhood, with bars on the windows and heavy curtains that never opened. They were holding 12 women in that house, all from Central America, all between the ages of 18 and 25. The women were told they were working off debts for their transportation to the U.S., but the debts kept growing no matter how much money they earned. Classic debt bondage. How were clients finding them? Online escort services, massage parlors, private parties. The house in Cicero was just one location. Maria says there are at least 3 others in the Chicago area, plus locations in Milwaukee, Detroit, and Miami. Marconi felt anger building in his chest. He'd spent years chasing traditional organized crime figures who dealt in drugs, gambling, and extortion. But human trafficking was different. These were people who bought and sold human beings like livestock. What do you need from me? Maria is willing to testify, but only if we can guarantee her safety and help her bring her younger sister to the U.S. legally. The problem is, we think there's a leak somewhere in the system. Every time we move against one of these operations, they seem to know we're coming. A leak where? That's what we need to find out. Could be FBI, could be local police, could be someone in immigration and customs enforcement, but someone's feeding information to Torino's organization. Kim closed her tablet and leaned back in her chair. I want you to work with us on this, but it has to be completely off the books. No reporting to your lieutenant, no official paperwork, no database entries. Can you handle that? Marconi thought about the young woman in the photo, about 12 other women being held against their will, about the network of criminals who profited from human misery. What's the plan? We're going to use Maria to set up a sting operation. She's agreed to contact her former captors and tell them she wants to come back, that being on the run is too dangerous. When they come to pick her up, we'll be waiting. And you think Torino will show up personally? Maria says Mr. Vincent always comes to collect new girls personally. He doesn't trust the details to subordinates. Over the next week, Marconi found himself working the strangest case of his career. By day, he continued his normal duties with the organized crime division, maintaining the pretense that nothing had changed. But nights and weekends were spent in safe houses and federal buildings, planning an operation that could either make his career or get him killed. Maria Santos was a remarkable young woman, barely 20 years old, but with the kind of inner strength that had allowed her to survive 8 months of hell and still find the courage to fight back. She spoke English with a heavy accent, but her intelligence was obvious as she helped federal agents understand the structure of the trafficking operation. The house in Cicero, it was like a prison, she told Marconi during one of their planning sessions. We were never allowed to leave, never allowed to call our families. They told us we owed them $50,000 each for bringing us to America, and that we had to work until the debt was paid. But the debt never got smaller? Never. They charged us for food, for clothes, for the room where we slept. Sometimes they would add money to the debt as punishment if we didn't do what they wanted. Marconi had seen the financial records. The women were generating hundreds of thousands of dollars for their captors, but their supposed debts only grew larger over time. Tell me about Mr. Vincent. Maria's expression darkened. He was the worst one. The others, they were just following orders, but Mr. Vincent, he enjoyed our fear. He would come to the house and line us up, inspect us like animals. If he didn't like how someone looked, or if they had been crying, he would punish them. What kind of punishment? Beatings, sometimes worse. There was one girl, Carmen, who tried to fight back when a client was hurting her. Mr. Vincent made us all watch while he burned her arm with a cigarette. Then he sold her to someone in Detroit. We never saw her again. The operation they were planning was risky for everyone involved, but especially for Maria. She would have to contact her former captors using a monitored phone line, convince them she was desperate to return, and then meet them at a location where federal agents could make arrests without putting her in danger. Are you sure about this? Marconi asked her during their final planning meeting. Once you make that call, there's no going back. These people will kill you if they suspect you're working with law enforcement. Maria looked him in the eye with a steadiness that reminded him why he'd become a cop in the first place. Detective, for 8 months I was not a person. I was property. If I can help stop them from doing this to other girls, then yes, I am sure. The call was made on a Tuesday evening. Maria, speaking in Spanish with fear in her voice that wasn't entirely fake, told her former captor that she was hiding in a motel on the west side, that she was scared and hungry and wanted to come home. The response was immediate. Someone would pick her up at midnight at a parking lot behind a 24-hour laundromat on Madison Street. Come alone, bring nothing, and if this was some kind of trick, her family in Honduras would pay the price. Marconi spent that Tuesday night in the back of a surveillance van, watching through night vision cameras as Maria sat alone on a bench outside the laundromat. She looked small and vulnerable in the harsh fluorescent light, like exactly the kind of desperate young woman who might beg to return to captivity. At 12:17 a.m., a black SUV pulled into the parking lot. Two men got out. One stayed with the vehicle while the other approached Maria. Even through the grainy surveillance footage, Marconi could see the predatory way the man moved, like a hunter approaching wounded prey. But it wasn't Vincent Torino. The man who collected Maria was someone Marconi didn't recognize. Mid-30s, stocky build, wearing a leather jacket despite the warm October night. "Where's Vincent?" Agent Kim asked through their radio connection. "Maybe he doesn't handle pickups anymore," Marconi replied. "Let's see where they take her." The SUV drove through the city for 20 minutes, with unmarked federal vehicles following at a distance. Marconi watched the GPS tracker they'd hidden in Maria's shoe move through familiar neighborhoods, through Little Village, past Midway Airport, into the industrial area near the Sanitary and Ship Canal. The vehicle stopped at a warehouse complex that Marconi recognized from his organized crime files. It was owned by Torino Construction, one of Vincent's legitimate businesses. "This is it," Kim said as federal agents moved into position around the warehouse. SWAT teams are in place. Surveillance is active. Now we wait to see who shows up. They didn't wait long. Within an hour, 3 more vehicles arrived at the warehouse, including a silver Mercedes that Marconi knew belonged to Vincent Torino himself. Through surveillance equipment, they watched as Maria was brought inside the warehouse and led to a large room where at least 15 other young women sat on folding chairs arranged in rows. It looked like a human auction. "Jesus Christ," Kim whispered as they watched Vincent Torino enter the room, flanked by 2 bodyguards. "They're not just trafficking women, they're selling them to buyers who come to these events." Over the next 2 hours, Marconi watched the most disturbing thing he'd ever seen in his career. Well-dressed men entered the warehouse, examined the women like livestock, and negotiated prices with Torino and his associates. Money changed hands, and women disappeared into the night with their new owners. "We have to move," Marconi said, as he watched a man in an expensive suit lead 2 terrified teenagers toward the exit. "We can't let this continue." "Wait," Kim said. "Maria's giving us the signal." On the surveillance monitor, they could see Maria touching her ear, the agreed-upon sign that she was ready for law enforcement to move in. The raid happened fast. Federal agents stormed the warehouse from 3 directions while local police blocked all exits. Most of the buyers fled in panic, but several were arrested along with Torino and his entire operation. When the smoke cleared, they'd rescued 18 women from Central America, arrested 12 people including Vincent Torino, and seized evidence of a trafficking network that spanned half the country. But the real victory came 3 weeks later, when Maria Santos testified before a federal grand jury. Her testimony, combined with financial records and surveillance footage, resulted in indictments against 23 people involved in the trafficking network. Vincent Torino was sentenced to life in prison without parole. His restaurants were seized under federal asset forfeiture laws, and his entire criminal organization collapsed within 6 months. However, the investigation revealed something even more disturbing than Marconi had imagined. The leak in law enforcement wasn't coming from a single corrupt official. It was a systematic operation involving multiple agencies. Assistant U.S. Attorney David Chen, who had been prosecuting organized crime cases for 5 years, had been feeding information to criminal organizations in exchange for substantial bribes. Chen had access to federal investigations, witness protection programs, and planned raids, which he sold to the highest bidder. "He's been compromising cases for years," Agent Kim explained as They reviewed evidence of Chen's corruption. Every time we got close to a major arrest, Chen would tip off the targets. That's why so many of our operations failed. The discovery of Chen's betrayal led to a comprehensive review of dozens of cases he'd handled. Several convicted criminals were released when it became clear their prosecutions had been tainted by his corruption. Others, who should have been in prison, were still walking free because Chen had sabotaged their investigations. But Chen wasn't working alone. The investigation uncovered a network of corruption that included 2 FBI agents, an Immigration and Customs Enforcement supervisor, and 3 Chicago police officers. They'd been selling information about federal investigations to organized crime families throughout the Midwest. "It's like a cancer," Marconi said as he reviewed the scope of the corruption. These people were supposed to be protecting witnesses and victims, but instead they were selling them out to the criminals who wanted them dead. The corruption scandal ultimately led to the resignation of the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Illinois and a complete restructuring of several federal law enforcement agencies. 17 law enforcement officials were convicted of federal crimes, including Chen, who received a life sentence for his role in facilitating human trafficking. For Marconi, the case was a career-defining moment that led to his promotion to a federal organized crime task force. But it also left him with a profound understanding of how corruption can undermine even the most well-intentioned investigations. Maria Santos was granted asylum in the United States and eventually became a U.S. citizen. She now works with federal law enforcement to identify and rescue other trafficking victims, and she's helped bring down dozens of similar operations throughout the Midwest. The warehouse where she was held is now a community center that provides services to immigrant families. But Marconi still drives by sometimes, remembering the night they proved that sometimes the biggest criminals wear badges and carry law degrees. The Torino family's criminal empire was dismantled piece by piece over the following year. Vincent's brothers and cousins were arrested on various charges, their businesses were seized, and their political connections were exposed. The family that had controlled organized crime in Chicago for 3 generations was effectively eliminated. But new criminal organizations quickly moved in to fill the vacuum left by the Torino's downfall. Within 6 months, rival families from New York and Detroit had established operations in Chicago, leading to a violent turf war that claimed dozens of lives. "That's the thing about organized crime," Marconi observed as he watched news reports of the latest gang violence. "Take down one family, and 3 more fight to replace them. The demand for illegal services never goes away." The human trafficking network that Torino had facilitated was more resilient than anyone expected. Despite the arrests and convictions, similar operations continued throughout the region, operated by different criminal organizations but using the same basic model of debt bondage and forced labor. Marconi found himself working case after case involving trafficking victims, women and children who had been promised legitimate work but instead found themselves trapped in cycles of abuse and exploitation. Each case reinforced his belief that human trafficking was one of the fastest growing and most profitable criminal enterprises in the world. "The economics are simple," he explained to a group of new detectives during a training session. "A drug dealer can sell cocaine once, but a human trafficker can sell the same person over and over again. It's a business model that generates enormous profits with relatively low risk." The investigation also revealed the international scope of the trafficking network. The women, who had been held in Chicago, were part of a pipeline that stretched from Central America through Mexico and into the United States. Criminal organizations in multiple countries were coordinating their efforts, sharing resources, and dividing profits. "We're not just fighting local criminals," Agent Kim told the task force during one of their weekly meetings. we're fighting international cartels that have more resources and better coordination than some governments. The complexity of the trafficking network required an equally sophisticated law enforcement response. The task force that had started with a handful of agents and detectives eventually grew to include representatives from dozens of agencies, both domestic and international. Marconi found himself traveling to Honduras and Guatemala, working with local police to identify and arrest the recruiters who were convincing young women to travel to the United States. The cooperation wasn't always smooth. Many local officials were either corrupt or simply overwhelmed by the scope of the problem. Corruption is like a virus, observed Captain Rodriguez of the Honduran National Police, as he and Marconi reviewed arrest reports in Tegucigalpa. It spreads from one agency to another until you can't trust anyone in the system. But there were also success stories. The task force's efforts led to the rescue of over 200 trafficking victims and the arrest of more than 50 people involved in the network. Several of the rescued women were able to return safely to their home countries, while others chose to remain in the United States and rebuild their lives. Maria Santos became a symbol of survival and resilience, speaking at conferences and working with advocacy groups to raise awareness about human trafficking. Her courage in testifying against her captors inspired other victims to come forward, leading to additional prosecutions. She saved more lives than just her own, Marconi reflected as he attended a ceremony, honoring Maria's contributions to the fight against trafficking. Her willingness to speak up broke open a case that might have remained hidden for years. The warehouse raids also uncovered evidence of other criminals' activities. Vincent Torino's organization had been involved in drug trafficking, weapons smuggling, and cybercrime in addition to human trafficking. The financial records seized during the raids provided intelligence that was used to prosecute dozens of other cases. Organized crime families don't specialize in just one type of illegal activity, Marconi learned. They're criminal conglomerates that diversify their revenue streams to maximize profits and minimize risk. The investigation ultimately changed how law enforcement agencies approached organized crime cases. Instead of focusing on individual criminal activities, investigators began looking at criminal organizations as business enterprises that needed to be dismantled systematically. You can't just arrest the street-level operatives, Agent Kim explained during a presentation to federal prosecutors. You have to follow the money, seize the assets, and destroy the infrastructure that allows these organizations to operate. The Torino case became a model for subsequent organized crime investigations throughout the country. The techniques developed during the investigation, financial analysis, multi-agency coordination, victim-centered prosecution strategies, were adopted by law enforcement agencies across the United States. But for Marconi, the most important lesson was personal. He learned that organized crime wasn't just about abstract criminal enterprises. It was about real people whose lives were destroyed by greed and exploitation. Every case file represents someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's mother. He would tell younger detectives, "We're not just building cases, we're fighting for people who can't fight for themselves." The warehouse where the final raids took place was eventually demolished, but a memorial garden was planted on the site to honor the victims of human trafficking. Maria Santos helped design the memorial, choosing flowers that reminded her of her home in Honduras. Marconi visits the memorial sometimes, remembering the night they brought down one of Chicago's most powerful criminal organizations. But he also thinks about all the cases they haven't solved yet, all the victims they haven't found, and all the criminals who are still out there treating human beings as commodities to be bought and sold. The fight against organized crime never really ends. It just evolves as criminals adapt their methods, and law enforcement develops new strategies to combat them. But occasionally, on nights like the one at the warehouse, Justice prevails and the good guys actually win. Detective Rachel Morrison had been with Internal Affairs for 6 months when she caught the case that would define her career and nearly destroy her life. It started with a routine misconduct allegation. Officer Jimmy Kowalski allegedly roughing up a suspect during a drug arrest. But within 2 weeks, Morrison found herself investigating the largest police corruption scandal in Chicago's history. The complaint came from a defense attorney named Marcus Webb, who represented a small-time dealer named Carlos Mendez. According to Webb, his client had been beaten unconscious by Kowalski during what should have been a simple arrest for possession. "Look at these photos," Webb said as he sat across from Morrison in the sterile conference room of the Internal Affairs Division. Carlos was hospitalized for 3 days with a concussion and broken ribs. The official report says he resisted arrest and fell downstairs, but there are no stairs anywhere near the arrest location. Morrison studied the medical photos Webb had provided. Carlos Mendez looked like he'd been hit by a truck. Multiple facial fractures, severe bruising, and defensive wounds on his arms that suggested he'd tried to protect himself from a sustained beating. "What does your client say happened?" He says Officer Kowalski and 2 other cops dragged him into an alley behind a liquor store on South Halsted. They wanted to know where he kept his money and drugs, and when he wouldn't tell them, they started beating him. Morrison made notes as Webb continued. Internal Affairs investigations were always delicate. Cops investigating cops, with careers and reputations hanging in the balance. But the photos suggested something more serious than typical police misconduct. Did anyone witness the arrest? That's the interesting part. The official report lists 2 witness officers, Detective Ray Santos and Officer Mike Chen, but neither of them filed supplemental reports and the arrest was made outside their usual patrol area. Morrison knew both officers by reputation. Santos was a respected detective with 15 years of experience, years on the force, while Chen was a rookie who'd graduated from the academy less than a year ago. If they were involved in beating a suspect, it suggested a wider problem than one bad cop. "I'll need to interview all 3 officers," Morrison told Webb, "and I want to examine the evidence from the drug arrest." "Good luck with that. The evidence seems to have disappeared from the property room." Morrison felt a familiar chill. Missing evidence was a red flag that suggested someone was trying to cover up more than police brutality. She spent the next day reviewing Officer Kowalski's file. Jimmy Kowalski, 34, 8 years on the force, assigned to the South District Narcotics Unit. His record showed several commendations for drug arrests, but also a pattern of civilian complaints that had been dismissed or resulted in minor disciplinary action. More troubling was Kowalski's financial situation. Despite earning a police officer's salary, he owned a house in an expensive suburb, drove a new BMW, and had recently purchased a boat. His wife didn't work, and they had no obvious source of additional income. Morrison's first interview was with Officer Chen, who seemed nervous from the moment he sat down across from her. "Tell me about the arrest of Carlos Mendez on October 15th, she said, her digital recorder running between them. "It was a routine drug bust," Chen replied, not making eye contact. "We received a tip that Mendez was dealing near the liquor store on Halsted. Officer Kowalski made the approach, suspect resisted, and we subdued him using appropriate force. You say we. Who else was involved?" "Detective Santos and myself. We were backing up Officer Kowalski." Morrison pulled out the medical photos. "Does this look like the result of appropriate force to you?" Chen's face went pale as he looked at the images. The suspect fell down some stairs during the struggle. "Officer Chen, there are no stairs near the arrest location. I've been to the scene." Chen began to sweat. his hands shaking slightly as he reached for a glass of water. Maybe I'm remembering wrong. It happened fast. Are you lying to me, Officer Chen? No, ma'am. I'm telling you what I remember. But Chen's body language told a different story. Morrison had conducted enough interviews to recognize deception, and Mike Chen was clearly terrified of something. Her interview with Detective Santos went differently. Santos was calm, professional, and stuck to the same story Chen had told. Routine arrest. Suspect resisted. Appropriate force was used. Detective, you've been on the force for 15 years. You've seen plenty of arrests. Does Carlos Mendez's condition seem consistent with someone who simply resisted arrest? Santos looked at the photos without flinching. Some people fight harder than others. Sometimes subduing a suspect requires significant force. Even when the suspect is 60 pounds lighter than the arresting officer, drugs can make people unpredictably strong. Morrison found Santos's responses practiced, almost rehearsed. Unlike the nervous rookie Chen, Santos seemed prepared for these questions. When she finally interviewed Jimmy Kowalski, Morrison encountered a different kind of problem. Kowalski was arrogant, dismissive, and seemed to view the investigation as a personal attack rather than a legitimate inquiry into police conduct. "Listen, Detective Morrison," he said, leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed. "I've been doing this job for 8 years. I've taken more drugs off the street than most cops see in their entire careers. Sometimes the bad guys get hurt. That's the nature of police work. The medical evidence suggests Mr. Mendez was beaten severely. How do you explain that? He resisted arrest. We used the force necessary to subdue him. End of story. Where did this subduing, take place? In the alley behind the liquor store. The suspect tried to run. We pursued. He fell during the struggle." Morrison pulled out crime scene photos showing the alley. Clean pavement, no stairs, no obstacles that would explain Mendez's injuries. "There's nothing in this alley that would cause the kind of trauma Mr. Mendez sustained." Kowalski shrugged. "Maybe you should ask the suspect how he got hurt instead of questioning police officers who were just doing their jobs." The interview ended with Morrison having more questions than answers. All 3 officers were sticking to the same story, but the physical evidence didn't support their version of events. And the missing drug evidence suggested someone was trying to destroy proof of what had really happened. But Morrison's investigation took a dramatic turn when she received an anonymous phone call at her home that evening. "Detective Morrison, you need to stop looking into the Mendez case." The voice was male, muffled, like someone was speaking through cloth. "Who is this? Someone who knows what's really going on. The Mendez beating isn't about police brutality. It's about money, lots of money. And if you keep digging, you're going to find things that certain people don't want found." "What kind of things?" "Stop the investigation, Detective. For your own safety." The line went dead, leaving Morrison staring at her phone with a mixture of fear and determination. Someone was scared enough of her investigation to make anonymous threats, which meant she was getting close to something important. The next morning, Morrison decided to dig deeper into the financial records of all 3 officers involved. What she found made her stomach turn. Officer Chen, despite being a rookie with minimal savings, had recently made a cash-down payment on a new apartment in an expensive part of town. Detective Santos had paid off his mortgage early and purchased a vacation home in Wisconsin. And Jimmy Kowalski's lifestyle was clearly being funded by money that didn't come from his police salary. But the real breakthrough came when Morrison examined their duty assignments over the past year. All 3 officers had been involved in dozens of drug arrests together, despite being assigned to different districts and units. They were operating as an unofficial team, working cases outside their normal jurisdictions. Morrison pulled the files on every arrest the three had made together and found a disturbing pattern. In case after case, large amounts of cash and drugs that should have been logged as evidence had either gone missing or been recorded in amounts far smaller than what witnesses reported seeing. The Carlos Mendez case wasn't about police brutality, it was about robbery. The three officers were stealing money and drugs from suspects, and when Mendez wouldn't tell them where he kept his stash, they'd beaten him unconscious. But Morrison's investigation was about to become much more dangerous. She was working late Friday evening, alone in the Internal Affairs office, when she heard footsteps in the hallway outside. The building should have been empty except for security guards, but these footsteps were deliberate, purposeful. Morrison quietly locked her office door and dimmed the lights, watching through the frosted glass as shadows moved in the hallway. 3 figures stopped outside her door, and she heard quiet voices discussing something in urgent whispers. One of the voices belonged to Jimmy Kowalski. Morrison grabbed her cell phone and crept toward the window, but her office was on the 4th floor with no fire escape. She was trapped. The door handle turned slowly, and Morrison realized with horror that someone had a key to her office. She pressed herself against the wall beside the door frame, her service weapon drawn, as the door swung open. Jimmy Kowalski entered first, followed by 2 men Morrison didn't recognize, civilians in expensive suits who moved with the controlled precision of professional criminals. "She's not here," Kowalski said as they searched the dark office. "But look at this." Morrison watched from her hiding spot as they examined her evidence board. Photos, financial records, arrest reports, all connected by red string showing the pattern of corruption she'd uncovered. "This is a problem," said one of the civilians, a tall man with graying hair and the kind of face that belonged in corporate boardrooms. "She knows too much." "I told you we should have handled this differently," Kowalski replied. "Morrison's not some street cop you can intimidate. She's internal affairs. If she disappears, there will be federal investigations. Then we need to discredit her. Make it look like she's the corrupt one." Morrison felt cold fear wash over her as she listened to them plan her destruction. These weren't just dirty cops. They were part of something much larger and more dangerous. Her phone buzzed with a text message, and all 3 men froze at the sound. Morrison held her breath as Kowalski moved toward her hiding spot, his own weapon drawn. The office door suddenly burst open as building security guards entered, drawn by reports of unauthorized personnel in the building. In the confusion that followed, Morrison slipped out through the chaos and ran for the stairwell. She spent that night in a downtown hotel, paying cash and using a fake name as she tried to process what she'd discovered. The corruption wasn't limited to 3 officers stealing drug money. There were civilians involved, people with enough power and resources to plan the elimination of a police detective. Saturday morning, Morrison called the FBI. Special Agent Lisa Park met her at a coffee shop in the Loop, far from any police facility where their conversation might be overheard. "Agent Park, I need federal protection and I need it now. I've uncovered a corruption ring that involves Chicago police officers and civilian criminals, and they're planning to kill me." Park listened intently as Morrison laid out everything she'd discovered. The pattern of thefts, the financial irregularities, the threats, and the conversation she'd overheard in her office. "How high up do you think this goes?" Park asked. "I don't know yet, but the civilian I saw in my office looked like serious money. This isn't just street-level corruption." Park made several phone calls, and within 2 hours, Morrison was in federal protective custody, while FBI agents began their own investigation into the allegations. What they found over the next month made Morrison's discoveries look small by comparison. The corruption ring involved not just the 3 officers Morrison had identified, but 17 members of the Chicago Police Department, including 2 lieutenants and a captain. They'd been working with a network of drug dealers and money launderers to steal evidence, sell confiscated drugs back to dealers, and eliminate competition for their criminal partners. The civilian Morrison had seen in her office was Anthony Torino, brother of mob boss Vincent Torino, and a major figure in Chicago organized crime. The police corruption ring had been providing him with intelligence about drug investigations, helping him consolidate control over the city's narcotics trade. But the most shocking discovery was that the corruption reached into the Cook County State's Attorney's Office. 2 prosecutors had been taking bribes to ensure that cases against protected dealers were dismissed or reduced to minor charges. "It's like a cancer," Agent Park explained as she briefed Morrison on the scope of the investigation. "The corruption has metastasized throughout the entire criminal justice system." The investigation, dubbed Operation Clean House by the FBI, revealed a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had been operating for at least 5 years. The corrupt officers weren't just stealing money and drugs, they were providing security for major drug operations, eliminating rival dealers, and using police resources to further their criminal activities. Jimmy Kowalski turned out to be one of the key figures in the operation. His narcotics unit had been systematically targeting independent drug dealers, stealing their money and product, and then selling the drugs to dealers who were part of the corruption network. They were running their own drug distribution operation using police badges as cover, Agent Park said as she showed Morrison surveillance photos of Kowalski meeting with known criminals. They'd arrest dealers who weren't part of their network, steal their drugs, and then sell those drugs through their own channels. Detective Santos had been providing intelligence about planned raids, allowing corrupt dealers to move their operations before law enforcement arrived. Officer Chen, despite being a rookie, had been recruited into the network because of his financial desperation. He owed gambling debts to the same criminal organization that was bribing the other officers. But the corruption went even deeper than theft and drug trafficking. The investigation uncovered evidence that the corrupt officers had been involved in witness intimidation, evidence tampering, and at least 3 murders of people who threatened to expose their activities. Carlos Mendez wasn't their first victim, Agent Park told Morrison as they reviewed the evidence. "We've found at least 6 other cases where suspects were beaten or killed after refusing to cooperate with their extortion schemes." The case that had started with Morrison investigating a simple police brutality complaint had uncovered a criminal conspiracy that involved dozens of people and millions of dollars in stolen money and drugs. The federal investigation culminated in a series of coordinated raids across Chicago and its suburbs. 17 police officers were arrested, along with 12 civilians, including Anthony Torino, and 2 prosecutors from the state's attorney's office. The raids recovered over $2 million in cash, substantial quantities of drugs that had been stolen from evidence rooms, and detailed records of the corruption network's activities. Several of the arrested officers agreed to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for reduced sentences. Jimmy Kowalski was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Detective Santos received 18 years. Officer Chen, who had provided substantial cooperation to investigators, received 8 years and was dismissed from the force. Anthony Torino was sentenced to life in prison under federal racketeering statutes, effectively ending his criminal organization's influence in Chicago's drug trade. For Morrison, the case was both a career triumph and a personal nightmare. She'd exposed the largest police corruption scandal in Chicago's history, but she'd also learned that the thin blue line could become a wall of silence that protected criminals as much as it protected honest cops. The investigation revealed that corruption had been enabled by a culture of secrecy and loyalty that discouraged officers from reporting misconduct by their colleagues. Many honest cops had suspected something was wrong, but were afraid to speak up because of potential retaliation. The blue wall of silence isn't just about protecting bad cops, Morrison reflected as she testified before a federal grand jury. It's about a system that punishes people for doing the right thing and rewards those who look the other way. Morrison transferred to the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, where she now investigates similar cases throughout the Midwest. But she still drives through her old district sometimes, remembering the night she hid in her own office while corrupt cops planned her murder, and wondering how many other Carlos Mendezes are out there, beaten and robbed by the people who were supposed to protect them. The South District Narcotics Unit was disbanded and reconstituted with entirely new personnel. New oversight procedures were implemented throughout the Chicago Police Department, including mandatory reporting of suspected misconduct and regular financial audits of officers in sensitive positions. Carlos Mendez received a settlement of $2.3 million from the city, though he still bears physical and psychological scars from his encounter with police corruption. He used part of the settlement to establish a foundation that provides legal assistance to victims of police misconduct. The investigation also led to the review of hundreds of cases that had been handled by the corrupt officers. Many convictions were overturned when it became clear that evidence had been planted or testimony had been fabricated. Several people who had been wrongfully imprisoned were released and received substantial settlements from the city. But perhaps the most important outcome of the investigation was the change it brought to police culture in Chicago. The department implemented new training programs focused on ethics and integrity, and established anonymous reporting systems that allowed officers to report misconduct without fear of retaliation. "Culture change is slow and difficult," said Police Superintendent Maria Rodriguez as she announced the reforms. "But we're committed to rebuilding trust between the police and the communities we serve." Morrison's investigation had ripple effects throughout law enforcement agencies across the country. Other departments began conducting their own internal reviews, looking for similar patterns of corruption and implementing new oversight measures. The liquor store where Carlos Mendez was arrested is still there, but the alley behind it has been converted into a small park with a memorial plaque dedicated to honest law enforcement and the pursuit of justice. Morrison helped design the memorial, and she visits it every year on the anniversary of the case that changed her life. The memorial serves as a reminder that the fight against corruption is never really over. There will always be people who abuse their authority for personal gain, and there will always be a need for investigators like Morrison who are willing to stand up to them. "Corruption is like rust," Morrison often tells young investigators. "It starts small and spreads if you don't address it immediately. The only way to prevent it is through constant vigilance and the courage to do what's right, even when it's dangerous." The warehouse where the corrupt officers stored their stolen drugs was eventually demolished, but its location is now marked by a community center that provides services to families affected by police misconduct. The center offers counseling, legal assistance, and advocacy for people who have been victims of corruption. Morrison sometimes volunteers at the center, helping other victims navigate the complex process of seeking justice against corrupt officials. She's learned that corruption cases are never just about the criminals who abuse their authority. They're about rebuilding trust and ensuring that law enforcement serves all members of the community. The case also highlighted the importance of independent oversight in law enforcement. Morrison's investigation succeeded because she was willing to follow the evidence wherever it led, even when it implicated respected colleagues and powerful criminal organizations. "Internal affairs isn't popular with other cops," Morrison observed during a training session for new investigators. "We're seen as traitors, as people who turn against our own, but somebody has to hold the line between law enforcement and lawlessness." The investigation ultimately demonstrated that corruption thrives in environments where accountability is weak and oversight is inadequate. The reforms implemented in Chicago after Morrison's investigation became a model for other departments struggling with similar problems. But Morrison knows that the fight against corruption is ongoing. New cases cross her desk regularly, and she continues to investigate allegations of misconduct with the same determination that drove her original investigation into the Carlos Mendez beating. Every case matters, she says. Every victim deserves justice, and every corrupt official needs to know that someone is watching. That's the only way we can maintain the integrity of the justice system. The blue wall of silence may never be completely broken, but Morrison's investigation proved that it can be cracked by determined investigators who refuse to be intimidated by threats or discouraged by institutional resistance. Years later, as she reflects on the case that defined her career, Morrison takes satisfaction in knowing that she helped expose a criminal conspiracy that was poisoning law enforcement from within. The price was high: threats to her safety, isolation from former colleagues, and the knowledge that corruption can exist anywhere. But the cost of doing nothing would have been much higher. The fight for integrity in law enforcement continues. One case at a time, one investigation at a time, one honest cop at a time. And Detective Rachel Morrison remains on the front lines of that fight, proving that sometimes the most important battles are fought not against external enemies, but against the corruption that can destroy institutions from within. Detective Susan Walsh had been staring at the same case file for 3 hours when the phone call came that would pull her into the darkest investigation of her career. It was a cold Tuesday morning in March, and she was reviewing evidence from a 1995 murder that had been gathering dust in the cold case unit for over 2 decades. The victim was Jennifer Morrison, a 23-year-old graduate student who'd been found strangled in her apartment near Northwestern University. Despite months of investigation, detectives had never identified a suspect or established a clear motive. The case had gone cold when the original investigators retired, leaving behind boxes of evidence and a family that had never stopped believing their daughter's killer was still out there. Walsh's phone rang at 10:47 a.m. Detective Walsh, Cold Case Unit. Detective, this is Dr. Margaret Chen at the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office. I'm calling about the Jennifer Morrison case from 1995. Walsh felt her pulse quicken. The medical examiner's office rarely called about 20-year-old cases unless something significant had developed. What can I do for you, Dr. Chen? We've been using new DNA analysis techniques to review old cases, and we found something interesting in the Morrison evidence. Can you come in this afternoon? 2 hours later, Walsh sat in the sterile environment of the medical examiner's laboratory, watching Dr. Chen examine tissue samples under a high-powered microscope. The original autopsy found skin cells under Jennifer Morrison's fingernails, but the DNA technology in 1995 wasn't sophisticated enough to develop a useful profile, Dr. Chen explained. With current techniques, we've been able to extract a complete genetic profile. Walsh leaned forward. Any matches in the database? That's where it gets interesting. The DNA doesn't match anyone in CODIS, but it does match evidence from 2 other unsolved cases. Dr. Chen pulled out files from 1993 and 1997. 2 more young women found strangled in their apartments. Both graduate students, both brunette, both in their early 20s. Sarah Williams, killed in 1993. Michelle Torres, killed in 1997. All 3 women were attacked in the same way. All 3 fought back, and all 3 managed to get DNA under their fingernails from their attacker. Walsh studied the crime scene photos, noting the similarities. Why weren't these cases connected before? Different jurisdictions, different investigators, and the DNA technology wasn't available to link them. Sarah Williams was killed in Evanston, Jennifer Morrison in Chicago, Michelle Torres in Oak Park. 3 different police departments working independently. So, we have a serial killer who operated in the mid-1990s and then either died, moved away, or stopped killing. Or got better at not leaving evidence, Dr. Chen added grimly. Walsh spent the rest of the week immersing herself in the 3 connected cases, building a profile of a killer who had remained unidentified for over 20 years. The pattern was consistent. Young women, graduate students, attacked in their apartments between 1993 and 1997, all strangled with a ligature that was never recovered. But there were differences, too. Sarah Williams had been studying psychology at Northwestern. Jennifer Morrison was working on a master's degree in journalism. Michelle Torres was pursuing a PhD in sociology at the University of Illinois at Chicago. The killer seemed to target intelligent, accomplished women who lived alone. All 3 victims had defensive wounds, suggesting they'd fought hard before being overpowered. And in all 3 cases, the apartments showed no signs of forced entry, suggesting the women had known their attacker or been convinced to let him inside. Walsh's breakthrough came when she decided to expand her search beyond the 3 confirmed cases. Using the new DNA profile, she requested that labs throughout the Midwest run comparisons against their unsolved homicides from the 1990s. The response was immediate and terrifying. Within a week, Walsh had matches from Milwaukee, Detroit, St. Louis, and Indianapolis. 8 additional cases spanning from 1992 to 1999, all involving young women found strangled in their apartments. The killer hadn't stopped in 1997. He'd expanded his hunting ground across the entire region. "We're not looking at a local serial killer," Walsh told Lieutenant Rodriguez as they reviewed the evidence in the cold case unit's conference room. "This guy was traveling, probably for work, killing women in different cities to avoid detection. 11 confirmed victims over 7 years. That we know of." Walsh nodded grimly. "There could be more. We're working with limited DNA evidence, and not every jurisdiction has the resources to run these comparisons." The investigation took on new urgency as Walsh coordinated with law enforcement agencies across 5 states. A joint task force was formed, with Walsh as the lead investigator on what had become one of the largest cold case investigations in the region's history. The profile that emerged was of a highly organized killer who planned his attacks carefully. He targeted women who lived alone, studied their routines, and gained entry to their apartments without force. He was mobile, intelligent, and had managed to avoid detection for nearly 3 decades. But cold cases require different investigative approaches than active homicides. Instead of chasing fresh leads and interviewing recent witnesses, Walsh found herself diving into the past, trying to reconstruct events from an era before cell phones, internet searches, and digital surveillance. She started with Jennifer Morrison's case, since it was the most thoroughly documented. Jennifer had been a journalism student at Northwestern, working on her master's thesis about media coverage of violent crime. She lived alone in a small apartment near campus and worked part-time at a local newspaper. Walsh interviewed Jennifer's surviving friends and family members, many of whom hadn't spoken about the case in years. What emerged was a picture of a bright, ambitious young woman who had been cautious about her personal safety but not paranoid. Jenny was always careful about locking doors and not walking alone at night, said her former roommate, Lisa Park, now a suburban mother of 3. But she wasn't the type to hide from life. She dated, went out with friends, lived like a normal graduate student. Did she mention feeling threatened by anyone? Any unusual phone calls or encounters? Lisa thought for a moment. There was something. Maybe a month before she died. She said someone had been asking questions about her at the newspaper where she worked. Not a co-worker, but someone who came in asking if she was available for an interview about her thesis research. Walsh felt her pulse quicken. Did she describe this person? Middle-aged guy, well-dressed, said he was a freelance journalist working on a story about crime reporting. Jenny thought it was legitimate at first, but when she tried to follow up, he'd given them a phone number that was disconnected. A stranger researching Jennifer's background a month before her murder, that was the kind of detail that could break a cold case wide open. Walsh spent the next 2 days at the newspaper where Jennifer had worked, going through personnel records and visitor logs from 1995. The newspaper, a small weekly publication that had since been absorbed by a larger chain, had kept surprisingly detailed records. In October 1995, a man identifying himself as David Martinez had visited the newspaper asking about Jennifer Morrison's research into crime reporting. He'd claimed to be a freelance journalist working on a national story about how local media covered violent crime. The description provided by newspaper staff was frustratingly generic. White male, 40s, average height and build, dark hair, professional appearance. But there was one detail that stood out. He'd mentioned that he'd already interviewed journalism students at schools in Milwaukee and Detroit. Milwaukee and Detroit, 2 cities where the killer had struck. Walsh immediately contacted her counterparts in those cities, asking them to check whether any of their victims had connections to journalism, media, or communications programs. The results were chilling. Sarah Williams, the 1993 victim from Northwestern, had been working on an independent study about criminal psychology and media representation. Michelle Torres, killed in 1997, had been researching the sociology of crime reporting for her dissertation. In Milwaukee, victim Amanda Foster had been a communications major writing her senior thesis on local news coverage. In Detroit, Maria Santos had been working as a freelance writer covering criminal justice issues. He's not choosing victims randomly, Walsh told the task force during their weekly conference call. He's specifically targeting women who are studying or writing about crime, law enforcement, or criminal justice. That's incredibly specific, said Detective Mike Brennan from the Milwaukee PD. What's his connection to those fields? Walsh had been wondering the same thing. The killer's knowledge of police procedures, his ability to avoid leaving evidence, and his apparent obsession with women studying criminal justice suggested someone with inside knowledge of law enforcement. Could be an ex-cop, a lawyer, a forensics expert, someone who works in the court system, she said. Someone who understands how investigations work and knows how to avoid detection. The task force decided to focus on the fake journalist angle. If the same person had been approaching multiple victims under the guise of researching crime reporting, there might be additional witnesses or records that could provide a better description or identifying information. Walsh spent the next month traveling to different cities, interviewing professors, newspaper editors, and anyone who might have encountered someone claiming to research crime reporting in the mid-1990s. The pattern that emerged was consistent. A professional-appearing man in his 40s, claiming to be a freelance journalist, asking detailed questions about women studying criminal justice topics. But the breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While reviewing old telephone records from Northwestern University, Walsh found something that made her blood run cold. In the weeks before each murder, someone had called the university's journalism department asking for contact information for students working on crime-related research. The calls had come from different numbers, but when Walsh traced them, they all led back to payphones in the Chicago area. More importantly, the caller had specifically asked for female graduate students working on thesis projects related to violent crime or law enforcement. He was hunting them, Walsh said as she stared at the phone records spread across her desk. This wasn't opportunistic killing. He was systematically identifying and targeting women who fit his specific criteria. The investigation took another dramatic turn when Walsh decided to expand her search beyond murder cases. If the killer had been active in the 1990s, there might be other crimes, attempted murders, assaults, or missing persons cases that could provide additional evidence. Working with FBI analysts, Walsh ran the DNA profile against databases of unsolved assaults and attempted murders from the same time period. What she found exceeded her worst fears. The DNA matched evidence from 6 additional cases, women who had survived attacks by the same killer. Unlike the murder victims, these women were still alive and could potentially identify their attacker. The first survivor Walsh interviewed was Catherine Reynolds, now 52 and living in suburban Milwaukee. In 1994, Catherine had been a criminal justice student at Marquette University when someone claiming to be a journalist had contacted her about her senior thesis on domestic violence prosecution. He called me at home and said he was writing an article about how criminal justice students viewed the legal system, Catherine told Walsh as they sat in her comfortable living room. He was very professional, asked intelligent questions about my research. When he suggested meeting in person for a more detailed interview, I agreed. Where did you meet? My apartment. I know that sounds naive now, but he seemed legitimate. He knew details about my thesis that only someone in the field would understand. Catherine described meeting with a man who matched the general description from other cases. Middle-aged, professional appearance, claiming to be a freelance journalist. But the interview had taken a dark turn when he'd begun asking increasingly personal questions. He wanted to know if I lived alone, what my schedule was like, whether I had a boyfriend. When I started getting uncomfortable and tried to end the interview, he became aggressive. Aggressive how? He grabbed my arm when I stood up to show him to the door. When I pulled away, he said something like, "Don't be difficult," and reached for something in his jacket pocket. I thought he was going for a weapon, so I started screaming and ran to the bathroom to lock myself in. Catherine had called 911 from her bathroom while the attacker tried to break down the door. When police arrived, he was gone, but he'd left behind a leather briefcase containing rope, duct tape, and what appeared to be a homemade ligature device. The police took the briefcase as evidence, but they never found the guy. I moved out of state a month later and tried to forget it ever happened. Walsh felt pieces clicking into place. The briefcase contents matched the method used in the murders. The victims had all been strangled with a ligature. Catherine Reynolds had interrupted the killer before he could complete his planned attack. Over the next 2 weeks, Walsh interviewed the other 5 survivors. Their stories were remarkably consistent. Professional-appearing man claiming to be a journalist, meeting under the pretense of discussing research about criminal justice topics. Attempted assault when the women became suspicious. But one survivor provided the detail that would finally identify the killer after 25 years. Margaret Foster, now 48 and working as a prosecutor in St. Louis, had been a law student in 1996 when she was contacted by someone claiming to research how law schools taught criminal procedure. Like the others, she'd agreed to meet for an interview. He seemed to know a lot about legal education and criminal law, Margaret told Walsh. Too much, actually. When I mentioned a specific case we'd studied in class, he corrected details that weren't in the textbook. I realized he had inside knowledge that a freelance journalist wouldn't have. What kind of inside knowledge? Details about police investigative procedures, forensic evidence handling, even specific techniques that detectives use during interrogations. When I asked where he'd learned these things, he said he'd been a police officer before becoming a journalist. Margaret had excused herself to make a phone call, ostensibly to confirm the interview with her professor, but actually to call university security. When she returned to her apartment, the man was going through her personal papers. I confronted him, and he became violent immediately. He grabbed me and tried to put something around my neck, some kind of cord or rope. We struggled, and I managed to scratch his face before he threw me against the wall and ran. Did you get a good look at him? Good enough. I was a law student. I knew how to observe details for testimony. White male, mid-40s, about 6 feet tall, dark hair with some gray scar on his left hand between his thumb and index finger. But the most important detail came when Margaret described her attacker's behavior during the struggle. He was trained in defensive tactics, the way he moved and tried to restrain me. And when I scratched his face, he swore in what sounded like police radio codes. Things like 10-4 and Code 7. It was like he was reverting to old habits under stress. A former police officer with knowledge of investigative procedures, trained in defensive tactics, familiar with radio codes, Walsh finally had a specific profile to work with. She spent the next month reviewing personnel records for police departments throughout the region, looking for officers who had left the force in the early 1990s and might fit the killer's profile. The search was complicated by incomplete records and departments that had since merged or been disbanded. But one name kept appearing in multiple jurisdictions: Robert Bobby Kowalski, a former Chicago police detective who had been dismissed from the force in 1992 following allegations of excessive force and sexual misconduct. Kowalski's file painted a picture of a cop who had crossed the line repeatedly. Multiple complaints from female suspects about inappropriate behavior. Allegations that he'd used police resources to stalk women. A pattern of violence that had eventually led to his termination. After leaving the Chicago PD, Kowalski had worked briefly for private security companies in several Midwest cities, including Milwaukee, Detroit, St. Louis, and Indianapolis. His employment history matched the geographic pattern of the murders almost perfectly. But when Walsh tried to locate Kowalski for questioning, she discovered that he died in 2003, apparently from a heart attack while living under an assumed name in Florida. The case seemed to hit another dead end until Walsh decided to pursue one final angle. If Kowalski was their killer, there might be evidence at his last known residence that could definitively link him to the crimes. Working with Florida authorities, Walsh obtained a search warrant for a storage unit that Kowalski had rented under his real name in 2001. The unit had continued to be paid for by automatic bank draft even after his death, and its contents had never been examined. What they found inside made Walsh's blood run cold. The storage unit contained detailed files on dozens of women, photographs, personal information, copies of university records, and what appeared to be surveillance notes. Among them were files on all 11 murder victims and the 6 survivors. But the most damning evidence was a collection of trophies, personal items taken from the crime scenes that had never been reported missing. A bracelet belonging to Jennifer Morrison, a necklace from Sarah Williams, earrings from Michelle Torres. The storage unit also contained journals in which Kowalski had documented his crimes in disturbing detail, describing each attack and expressing anger toward women who pretended to understand criminal justice but had never faced real violence. DNA evidence from several items in the storage unit confirmed what Walsh had suspected. Robert Kowalski was the serial killer who had terrorized young women across the Midwest for nearly a decade. But the journals revealed something even more disturbing. Kowalski hadn't stopped killing in 1999. He'd simply gotten better at hiding his crimes. The storage unit contained evidence linking him to at least 6 additional murders in Florida between 2000 and 2003, all involving women who fit his preferred victim profile. He was escalating, Dr. Patricia Raines, a criminal psychologist consulting on the case, explained as she reviewed Kowalski's journals. The time between attacks was getting shorter, and he was taking increasingly dangerous risks. If he hadn't died when he did, there would have been many more victims. The case was officially closed on September 15th, 28 years after Jennifer Morrison's murder. The families of the 17 confirmed victims finally had answers, even though justice would never truly be served. For Walsh, the investigation was both a professional triumph and a sobering reminder of how long evil can hide in plain sight. Kowalski had been a police officer, someone trusted to protect and serve, who had used his badge and training to become one of the most prolific serial killers in the region's history. The Cold Case Unit held a press conference announcing the resolution of the cases, with family members of the victims present to finally hear that their daughter's killer had been identified. There were tears, expressions of relief, and gratitude for the detective who had never stopped believing that the truth could be uncovered. But the investigation also raised troubling questions about how Kowalski had been able to continue his crimes for so long without being detected. His dismissal from the Chicago Police Department had been based on complaints of excessive force and sexual misconduct, warning signs that might have prevented future murders if they had been taken more seriously. The system failed these women, said Jennifer Morrison's mother, Patricia, as she spoke to reporters after the press conference. Bobby Kowalski should never have been allowed to continue working in law enforcement after the complaints against him. If he'd been properly investigated and prosecuted, my daughter and 16 other women might still be alive. The case led to reforms in how police departments handle misconduct allegations, particularly those involving sexual impropriety or violence against women. New protocols were established for sharing information between departments when officers transfer or seek employment elsewhere. Walsh's investigation also highlighted the importance of advances in forensic technology for solving cold cases. Without the new DNA analysis techniques, Kowalski's crimes might never have been connected, and the families of his victims would have continued living without answers. Technology is a powerful tool, but it's not a substitute for good detective work, Walsh observed during a training session for new investigators. The DNA evidence gave us the connections, but solving the case required old-fashioned police work, interviewing witnesses, following paper trails, and never giving up on the belief that the truth can be found. The storage unit where Kowalski's evidence was found was eventually cleared out and rented to someone else, but Walsh kept copies of all the files for the victims' families who wanted them. Some families chose to read Kowalski's journals and learn exactly what had happened to their daughters. Others preferred to remember their loved ones as they had lived, not as they had died. Catherine Reynolds, the survivor who had first described Kowalski's police training, became an advocate for victims' rights and worked with law enforcement agencies to improve their response to sexual assault cases. Her experience had taught her that survival sometimes means living with unanswered questions, but that justice can still be served even decades after the fact. I spent 29 years wondering who had tried to kill me and whether he was still out there, Catherine said during a victim impact statement at a hearing related to the case. Detective Walsh gave me the answer I needed to finally move on with my life. Sometimes, that's all we can ask for. The truth, even when it comes too late for some people. The investigation also revealed the international scope of Kowalski's activities. Evidence in the storage unit suggested he had been in contact with similar killers in other countries, sharing techniques and possibly coordinating attacks. This led to ongoing investigations by international law enforcement agencies looking for connections to unsolved cases in Europe and Canada. Walsh continued to work cold cases after the Kowalski investigation, but none would have the same impact on her career or personal life. She'd learned that some cases define a detective's career not because of their complexity or media attention, but because of the families they help and the closure they provide. every case matters, Walsh would tell new members of the cold case unit. Every victim deserves to have their story told, and every family deserves to know the truth. Sometimes it takes 20 years or more, but if we don't give up, the answers are out there. The next morning, after the press conference, Walsh was back at her desk, staring at another case file from 1987, another family that had been waiting decades for answers. Because in the cold case unit, solving one mystery just meant it was time to start unraveling the next one. The Jennifer Morrison case had taught her that evil can hide behind badges and professional credentials, that some predators are sophisticated enough to evade detection for decades, and that justice delayed is not always justice denied. Sometimes it just takes the right detective, the right technology, and the right moment for the truth to finally emerge from the shadows of the past.